Cheney had been practicing for years for survival in the Cold War kind of peril, and so they'd been practicing for a nuclear strike. And you would think that because of all the kind of wartime practices he'd gone through, he would have been able to deal with the terrorist threats and attacks of 9/11. In fact, he was caught off guard because they hadn't really focused on terrorism. And so there was panic in the White House, and I think a level of panic that people don't really realize. And it lasted beyond 9/11 into the weeks afterwards when, particularly the anthrax letters, there was a while there when Cheney thought that he may have personally been exposed to chemical, biological, or radioactive weapons and that he might die. And so what you have to, at least what I took from this, was that the threat from al-Qaeda was not just political, it was personal for Cheney. He felt personally targeted, and he has acted ever since in a way that some people think shows a real change in his personality. Think about the Bush administration. The two most powerful figures were and are Dick Cheney and Rumsfeld, and they were both characters who had been cabinet officers before. They had watched how Washington worked for decades. They truly understood how to push the levers, and they were joined again by David Addington, who's a fanatical lawyer and very, very bright, a tireless worker, who understood that the most important thing was to control what choices reached the president. And so they pretty much had a stranglehold on the paperwork that reached Bush, who really had very little experience in the national security area. So they took control of the government in many ways, at least in the war and terror. And it was a tiny little clique of people that was involved in this. The War Council consisted of 5 men. The charter member was probably David Addington, who was then the counsel to Vice President Cheney and is now his chief of staff. There was Tim Flanagan, who was a lawyer for the president, and there was Alberto Gonzales, who was the counsel to the president. There was John Yoo, who was a like-minded lawyer in the Justice Department, and there was Jim Haynes, who was the top lawyer in the Pentagon. And this little clique pretty much ran the whole policy on redesigning the laws as they pertain to the war on terror. It was amazing. I mean, the top lawyer at the National Security Council, John Bellinger, this was his area of expertise. He was not even allowed to know what was going on. And Condoleezza Rice, who was the National Security Advisor, and Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of State, they'd only learned about these tremendous legal changes when they were fait accompli already. And they tried to get the president to revisit it. But by then, all the momentum was in favor of moving forward. And Cheney, no matter what, was always the person who had the last say on these issues. Probably the most significant change that took place was the decision to jettison the Geneva Conventions and describe a whole population of prisoners that were not covered by any human rights or laws. And when they did that, what they did was they pushed over years of American tradition. Since the founding of America, George Washington made a point of saying that when there were captives in war, we were going to treat them humanely. And what the Bush administration did, and this little clique did, was say, we'll only treat them humanely in accordance with our military necessity, meaning when we want to, we will, when we don't want to, we won't. They also got rid of the process that defined who was really an enemy and who wasn't. So this is how we swept up many, many people who were completely innocent, and they wound up in places like Guantanamo because they got rid of the screening process, which is just a fundamental part of the rule of law, that there would be some sort of fair process where someone would have a right to say whether or not they were guilty or innocent. That did not take place because of the decisions that were made immediately after 9/11. And then they created their own trial system. Instead of using the U.S. criminal courts, they came up with military tribunals where they were just stacked completely in favor of the prosecution. And all kinds of rules that had long been just fundamental to U.S. rights were thrown out the window.